Hi, welcome to this video. This video is going to talk about the Payroll Protection Program, the PPP, which is how I'm going to refer to it because the rest is a mouthful. And I'm doing this video a little bit differently, mainly because of the fact that this Payroll Protection Program, just broke my rule, the PPP, is a pretty involved process, as I'm sure you, if you're a recipient of the funds, knows. And the forgiveness application is no different. It is very involved. There are, I think, 10 or 11 total pages of the forgiveness application that has been put out by the SBA. And I spent a few hours going through that forgiveness application, going through some of the guidance that has been issued by the SBA. And I wanted to put this video together to essentially outline how you should go about tackling that forgiveness application, some of the materials that you'll need for that, and some of the considerations and some of that guidance that I looked at. And what I mean by I'll be doing this video a little bit differently is you may see me sort of reaching towards the camera. I had to write a few things out for this one because it's a lot, and I may actually be referencing the application itself. So without further ado, let's jump into this thing. And I want to start with some general points that I think are helpful for the entire forgiveness application and helpful in just sort of determining the order in which to fill out the application. When I sat down to do this, it took me a few minutes just to sort of figure out and make sense of all of the different pages. The first page itself is just a bunch of definitions. So for the most part, the first page is very much just helpful. And you'll find that in those pages, the total of 11 pages, as I mentioned, a lot of those pages are just going to be guidance. So I would recommend at least reviewing the entire 11-page packet first, keeping in mind, however, though, that only page 6 and page 3, and those may, branch into more than just one page, but that's where the two forms that are required to be submitted will live. So page 6 and page 3. However, I think the general rule of thumb that's helpful here is start with page 9, go to page 6, finish with page 3. Page 6 and page 3 will actually be what you submit with some supporting documentation to your lender, which is a point to make. This paperwork goes to your lender first, and then your lender has 60 days to review what you've submitted and make a determination on your forgiveness, which is then sent to the SBA, who they then have 90 days to essentially pay your lender the amount that you're not going to pay them back. So kind of involved there, but 60 days from when you submit to your lender, then 90 days from there, the lender gets paid for the amount that you're forgiven and you do not have to pay. Kind of a side note on that, and something that I'll talk about a little bit later. In the event that the SBA ultimately, or your lender, determines that you were not eligible in the first place and should not have received PPP funds, your lender is going to be pretty upset about that because your lender then loses their 5% lender fee or something like that. So they're losing money and they're not getting paid back the forgiveness, and they're going to be pretty upset about that. And most likely it will be a loan for you, or worse, there can be penalties, which I said I'll get to in a second. So let's go back to a couple other general points to mention. So when you're talking about the non-payroll costs, right? Because the PPP essentially says 75% of those funds need to go to payroll and payroll-related costs. And what do those include? So that's going to be cash compensation, like your wages, salaries, tips, PTO. But that's also going to include things like your essentially your 401ks, your IRAs that you contribute to, your health plans, things like that. And then the non-payroll costs. Keep in mind that those are going to be like rent, loans, utilities, cell phones, internet, things like that. And on that note, for those non-payroll costs, which have to be 25% or less of the overall amount, right? Because 75% for payroll and payroll related, 25% for these non-payroll costs. For these non-payroll costs, the period of time that's going to be important is you will have needed to have those loans that you need to pay with the payroll protection funds, those rents, those utilities like internet, cell phones, things like that. All of those non-payroll bills and things that you have to pay with the PPP funds had to have been incurred, signed, in place, already obligating you to pay on or before February 15th, 2020. So your covered period of time, which I'll get to here in a second, is going to be the 56th, let's just talk about it now, the 56-day period of time from the first disbursement of the funds. If your funds are dispersed in intervals over time, you go to your first disbursement, and that is the first day of your 56-day covered period. Now, the covered period is important for a bunch of reasons, but the main reasons being is that for a lot of this application, you will be comparing January 1st to March 31st rather. So January 1st to March 31st, 2020 versus your covered period, which will be not necessarily April 1st, right after March 31st, but actually the first day in which you received funds from the PPP. That's day one of your 56-day covered period. And you will be comparing your covered period versus that pre-March 31st period in a lot of this application and a lot of this paperwork. Now, again, any of those non-payroll, rent, utilities, any of those types of loans and those costs have to have been incurred and obligated on or before 15th of February 2020. Now, a real quick note on what's called an alternative pay period or covered period, which you'll see in the paperwork. If your funds are dispersed in the middle of one of your pay cycles, then it creates a little bit of a funky situation for you on your covered period, because presumably that means that you're not using those funds for this immediately coming paycheck because you're in the middle of a cycle. So you're actually able to pick a later date for when you pay your next cycle and then use that as your 56-day covered period. So that's the alternative payroll period, or whatever it's called in here, alternative payroll covered period. So that's just a quick note on that. So let's go to the actual paperwork itself. So like I said, first you're going to start with page 9. However, you'll want to read pages 7 and 8 to get your bearings on what you need to put into page 9 and sort of what maybe documentation, get your payroll opened up, get your bank account, some of that stuff opened up so that you have those figures to complete page 9. Now on page 9, here's a few of the things that you're going to need to include. So cash compensation, that's going to be things like wages, tips, PTO, salary, all of that type of compensation, and it must be the gross amounts. So the amounts before taxes, before anything. It is the amounts gross, not net, and not after taxes. So keep in mind too, for that cash compensation number, there are upper limits, there's caps on what can be used for forgiveness per employee, and no single employee for the covered period, your 56-day period of time from first disbursement or into the alternative pay covered period, that 56-day period, for that period of time, no employee can receive $15,385 or more and still be eligible for forgiveness. So $15,385 for that 56-day period. An easy way to make sure you're calculating that is to take the gross amount that you would be paying or that is debited from your account for payroll for each employee for every 2-week period, and then multiply that by the 4 2-week periods for the 56-day. But again, $15,385 per employee, which corresponds with that $100,000 annual amount for employees. Now, full-time employment, FTE, you also have to calculate that on page 9 and then use those figures throughout the rest of the application on 6 and 3, pages 6 and 3. So that FTE, one of the easiest things to mention about calculating is that if you have 40-hour workers, you divide the 40 hours they work per week by 40, you get 1. That's typically going to be your number for every full-time employee for each of their weeks. Now, for example, I have a 3-day-a-week employee, so 24 hours divided by 40, which is 0.6. So I have a 1.6 FTE if I use those two for that part of the form. Now, also keep in mind that that part of the form requires you to round to the nearest tenth. So that would mean that it's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.6, and so on. Now, the reduction in forgiveness is an important piece, obviously, because you want as much forgiven as possible so that you're not stuck with a loan for the rest. And there's a few important things to keep in mind about the forgiveness. One of them is that you'll be comparing that January 1st to March 31st, 2020 period versus your covered period, which is then going to be what you look at for any employees that you offered to rehire and they refused, and you reported that, I'll get to that in a second. I kind of call that the Narc Rule. It's unfortunate, but you'll learn why. If someone was fired for cause, if they resigned, if they reduced their hours voluntarily, and that's a voluntary resignation. And again, if they refused to come back to work, if you offered to rehire them and you reported that to your employment office, all of those reasons I just mentioned actually do not reduce your forgiveness. Now, if you were letting employees go without cause, or if you offered to rehire them and they refused and you did not report it to your employment office in your state, those things could reduce the amount that is eligible for forgiveness, which is obviously, you can see, very tied to the circumstances of each employee and how your payroll has changed, again, from January 1st to March 31st versus your covered period of time. Now, second page you're going to work on, page 6. A few of the things that you're going to need for that page will include the amount that you pay for your health insurance for all your employees, the retirement contributions for all your employees, 401ks, IRAs, the state and federal taxes that you pay as an employer, not the ones that you withhold for your employees, and then your owner compensation. And these numbers are all related to the covered period. So all those things that I just covered, you want to give the numbers on this page 6 for the covered period of time. And for all of these things that I'm mentioning, you'll need paperwork to back all of this up. So you'll want things like your canceled checks or the cash checks, bank accounts, transfers, receipts for any of these health premiums, these retirement benefit account payments, any of these federal and state taxes, so any tax forms maybe, or your payroll reports. Payroll reports are going to be a great place for a lot of this information, but I bring it up because you will need to have documentation, which I'll get to in a little while, and is also contained on page 10, I believe, is going to be all of the documentation that you need. Yes, page 10. I'll get there in a second. So now, that's page 6. Those are a few of the things that you're going to need to include, and you'll see as you fill this out, page 9 feeds page 6, which feeds page 3. And again, page 6 and page 3 are the ones you submit. Now, the next step is going to be filling out page 3, and you'll need all of the math and the figures from those previous pages to do that. And then fourth, I wanted to mention that in addition to submitting those pages 6 and 3, you will need to submit those documents from page 10. And those documents on page 10 are not just for your covered period. You'll need to be submitting documentation for the January 1st to March 31st, as well as all of the documentation supporting the amounts for your covered period. Now, let's get to some of those documents on that page 10. So, the documents that you're going to be looking to submit, and there will be these documents plus other documents that you probably gather throughout this process, and you will need to keep those for a total of 6 years. Don't get rid of those documents. My faith in our government to be able to administer the forgiveness and handle these, given the volume of applications they'll receive, is not high. And so you keeping that paperwork for 6 years, as much of it's a record-keeping and administrative hassle, do it, because it could bail you out in the long run if a government office or some type of government agent or audit is mistaken and you have the documentation to prove it. So let's talk about some of that documentation. Things that they will accept for, let's say, for instance, your payroll costs that you're looking to be forgiven. Bank statements, payroll reports is going to be a great one. I highly recommend, if you have a payroll provider, to get in line with them. They should have some type of documentation and reporting in light of all of this that they can give you. Tax forms or the payroll equivalent, those are going to be very helpful. A lot of the time for payroll tax filings, you can look to IRS Form 941. That can be helpful. Canceled checks and other proof of your insurance payments that I mentioned, and your retirement account payments, transfers, checks, bank statements. And then for your FTE that you have to show, that's going to be employment records. Again, payroll provider will have these records, but internally you should have who you've hired and fired. Those are the records that they're looking for the FTE to provide proof and documentation of those numbers that you submit. That's that 1.6 for me, different numbers for you depending on your circumstances, of course. Now, you're going to have things that you need to show for your non-payroll costs, right? Lending, different types of utilities, things like that. So for that, you'll need, let's say you have a mortgage, you'll need the lender, amortization, hate that word, or receipts and canceled checks. Again, that's going to be something that you can use. For business rent and lease payments, current lease agreement, you should have that. Those typically always have to be in writing. That's a great thing to have. Or receipts and canceled checks again. And then for business utility payments, obviously those are going to be a little bit easier if you have invoices or paid bills that you can submit to provide evidence there. And then, of course, like I mentioned, keep these all for 6 years. And any of the numbers that you put into any of these other pieces of the paperwork, any of the actual worksheets themselves, you'll want to make sure that anything you're using to fill all this stuff out, that you actually have the documentation that you used for that too, even if it doesn't end up being the documentation that you submit with your application, because you never know if your lender or the SBA is going to request additional information. And the more that you have, and I'm not saying submit it all like a kitchen sink when you submit this. I would submit only what they ask for. But if you have all of this documentation organized, prepared, and ready to go, then you're in a much better position to argue against any refusal or reduction in your forgiveness, or any issues where they say you weren't eligible in the first place. You have all the paperwork to prove that you were and that you should get that forgiveness. So those are some of the documents. Let's get to a few final notes before I wrap this up. We're getting a little long here. I know lawyers can be long-winded. So I mentioned the alternative payroll period. That's going to be, again, if you're in a funky sort of in the middle of a pay period, you can pick your 56-day period for when that next payroll cycle comes in. The Narc Rule that I mentioned. So unfortunately, in all of these situations, if you offer to rehire an employee, they were furloughed maybe, or you had let them go and you offer to rehire them and they refuse to come back to work. This can be for any number of reasons. They don't feel safe, any number of reasons, and they refuse to come back. Well, you have to report that to your state unemployment office, or it will ultimately, or could, best case, but most likely will, impact your ability to reduce, actually will reduce the amount that you can have forgiven. So to be clear on that, if you offer to rehire and they refuse and you do not report it, that could hurt how much can be forgiven based on your payroll costs, because that person would affect your overall maintaining of the 75% payroll threshold that the PPE and the SBA is looking for. So I call that the Narc Rule because unfortunately, in order to preserve your forgiveness, you need to report that to your local or state unemployment office, which is going to prevent them from continuing to receive unemployment. So that's going to be a judgment call. I think that if it were me, I would be looking at this of a situation of, can I afford to pay this back as a 1% loan? Is that something that I can take on in order to help my employee that's too scared to come back to work and allow them to continue to receive unemployment, and then I take the hit? Judgment call for you, certainly, to make. That's just something I wanted to put out there that would be a quandary that I would find myself in, and something that I would have to decide on what one is going to work for me in the best interest of my staff and that employee. And this doesn't go into the rabbit hole of if that employee has a suppressed or vulnerable immune system or has some other risk factor that they may validly refuse to come back to employment. Totally different topic, not covered in this video. Now, let's talk about if you have to reduce the hours of an employee during your covered period. That also should not hurt your forgiveness, because if you reduce their hours, which then in turn reduces your payroll, which would on its face look like a reduction of your payroll, that will not count against you. It will not reduce your forgiveness, because the SBA apparently understands in its recent guidance that during these times, operations are not the same and you may need to reduce hours even if you do bring people back. That can also be helpful in the unemployment conversation. If you have enough staff, you can reduce some of their hours. Maybe that gets below the 25% threshold of their unemployment. Topic for another video, which we have one on. Check that out. And then the only other thing that I think I should cover here with all of this is going to be that there's one last page to the application. It's about the demographics of your staff and your company. Now, I think that people are going to hesitate to fill that out, especially if you may have green card employees and things like that. And I think that it's going to be a judgment call for you whether or not you want to report race, ethnicity, veteran status, gender with your forgiveness application. I find myself torn on that for a number of different reasons. However, at the end of the day, I do think that those statistics and making sure that those statistics are recorded with our government and every level possible in order to retain the numbers of lack of diversity, probably in a lot of cases, but also diversity, and also to determine in the long run when we look back on this, whenever we go back to whatever the new normal is, who got the help they needed, if the pool of people that got it was diverse enough, if there were women-owned businesses, if there are minority-owned businesses. And so as much as I sort of shudder sometimes and am reluctant to share information with our current government that I may think may prejudice them or cause bias in them, I think that it might be important in the long run for record-keeping's sake and for the purposes of ensuring that if we don't do it right this time around, which I won't get on the personal soapbox too much more, that we do it right the next time if we didn't this time. So that one's a judgment call for you. It's not a required form of the application because, again, 6 and 3, those are the required. And the rule of thumb, start with 9, then go to 6, then go to 3. Now, I hope this was helpful. I know it's a lot. I know I spoke fast. It's a lot to cover. I wanted to get through it. Hopefully, because it's a video, you can stop, pause, slow down, play again. And of course, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We were not eligible for the PPP. We did not get any funds. We do not have to fill out this application. I merely did this to be helpful and in my hope that this can provide guidance, because I sure as hell know when I sat down with this thing, it was confusing. So hopefully this alleviates some of that and you found it helpful. Thank you for tuning in and listening to this hot air and this face talk. Appreciate it. Hope you stay safe and hope you get as much of your funds forgiven as you can. Thanks.